Welcome to the Capstone Project course of the Back-End Developer Specialization. The Capstone Project for this course is based on a scenario involving the Little Lemon restaurant. In particular, the owners of Little Lemon want to extend the Reserve a Table functionality on the Little Lemon website. This is where you come in. In this course, you will learn how to build a web API. In doing so, you will demonstrate a wide range of skills by composing an API that allows users to reserve a table for the Little Lemon restaurant. This course will guide you through the process of building the app by combining all the skills and technologies you've learned throughout this specialization. Now, you may be wondering how this course is structured. Well, the course consists of 4 modules: starting the project functionality, security and testing, and project assessment. In the first module, starting the project, you'll do exactly that. Get started with the Capstone project. This will include a brief recap of and links to content in the Django course you have already completed. You'll start by setting up a coding environment, a Django project, and a Git repository for the project on GitHub, so you are ready to proceed with the development phase of the project. You'll also briefly recap the concepts of URLs and routes and set up the static routes to serve static content using HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. Module 2 is all about the functionality of the Capstone project. Based on the database schema for the table booking system, you will code the models and API using the Django REST framework. The front end will query and interact with the table reservation API to send and retrieve data from a MySQL database. You will consolidate your knowledge about databases and models to work with the MySQL database. Then, using the Django REST framework, you will implement the menu API to return a list of food menu items. Next is Module 3, which covers security and testing. In this module, you will practice your skills in setting up user authentication. The user requirements are a user registration page, a user login page, and a logout button. You must also set up security, so the user must be logged in to book a table. In the final module, you'll have the chance to reflect on all you have learned and your accomplishments. Then you will complete the final project for the Little Lemon website. Once the project is complete, you'll have the opportunity to perform a self-review of your project and a peer review of other learners' projects. You will assess the app's ability to reserve a table, assessing the projects in terms of back-end architecture, functionality, design, and code. With all of this to look forward to, I'm sure you are eager to begin. Let's get started with your project. Now that you've been introduced to the course, it's time to start setting up for the Capstone project. In this video, you'll revise several concepts related to setting up a Django project. First, you'll need to make sure that you have your coding environment ready for work. As per the objective of this course, you will build a Django application for the Little Lemon restaurant. On your local machine, you'll perform the following tasks and checks to install Python, install VS Code, create and activate a virtual environment, and install the Django framework. If you don't have Python installed locally, download the Python installer for your operating system and architecture from the official website. Then perform the installation by following the installation wizard. Likewise, carry out similar steps to download and install VS Code. You can find links to these official websites from the additional reading at the end of this lesson. Once Python and VS Code is set up, Python recommends using separate virtual environments for each Django application so that the dependencies do not conflict. For example, use the venv module in Python's standard library to create a virtual environment named Little Lemon. Once you create the virtual environment, you must activate it and install the Django framework library using the pip installer utility. Recall that once Django is installed, a command line utility named Django admin is made available in the scripts directory. It's important to know that the location of this script and its associated folders is different depending on your operating system, so please refer to the additional reading at the end of this lesson. To create a Django project, run the start project command. Then, step inside the project directory and run the command to start the development server. Recall that the Django development server will run and you can load the localhost URL from your web browser. Next, you must create an app inside the project using the start app command. It's important to remember that you add the app to the settings.py file in the installed apps list. Once your Django project is set up, it's time to push the code to your GitHub repository. The steps are as follows. In your browser, visit the GitHub website, sign up and create a new repository named Little Lemon. Back in your local machine, open the Git Bash terminal and navigate to the Django project folder. Next, initialize the local repository with git init command. Then add the project to the repository and commit. Finally, push the local repository to the GitHub repository you have created. In this video, you revise the key concepts related to setting up a Django project. In this video, you will recap the concepts of URLs, routes, and views in Django. Modern web frameworks such as Django use route-based URLs instead of classical file-based URLs. Recall that the part of the URL after the domain name is called the URL path, and the URL path may contain path and query parameters. For example, suppose you enter the URL littlemon.com/menu/2. In this example, menu is the path and 2 is the path parameter. The HTTP client, such as the browser or any HTTP client utility like CURL, sends the URL request with HTTP GET, POST, PUT, or DELETE methods. Now, let's explore how a Django web application handles a request from any client. A Django project uses the URL conf for this purpose. Usually, the Python module is referred to by the root_URL conf variable in the project settings.py file. When you create a Django project with the start project command, this variable is set to urls.py in the project package folder. The URLs module in the project package acts as the URL dispatcher. It defines a URL patterns variable, a list of routes created by the path function found in Django.urls module. When you use the start app command to create an app inside the Django project, you create another urls.py file inside the app folder and define a URL patterns list. Each item in the list is a route, and the path function binds a URL path to a view function. You must also add the app to the installed apps list in the settings.py file. The URL configuration of an app is included in the project's URL configuration. When a URL is received from the client, Django matches it with the URL patterns defined in the URL conf. When the first instance of the matching URL pattern is found, Django imports the associated view. Recall that a view is either a Python function or a view class conventionally defined in the views.py file inside the app folder. The view receives the HTTP request object from the URL dispatcher and any path parameters captured by the URL pattern definitions. The view function processes the request along with the data that comes in the form of path, query, or body parameters. If required, it interacts with a model and returns its HTTP response directly or by rendering a template. If the URL doesn't match any of the patterns available with the URL conf, Django invokes the corresponding error handling view. Recall that the route-based URLs in a web application render dynamic content. Many times, web applications need to render certain static content in the form of images, JavaScript code, or CSS styles. These static assets are placed in the designated static folder. The settings.py file defines a static URL variable, usually set to static. It refers to a directory named static in the project's base directory. Additionally, there is a variable defined called static files dirs to tell Django where to look for the static assets. You use the load static template tag to fetch the URL of the static asset rendered by the template. In this video, you recapped the key concepts of URLs, routes, and views in Django. In this module, you prepared to build the Django application with the functionality to reserve a table. You began with an introduction to the course content and the syllabus and had an opportunity to meet your peers. Finding success in web development means using the right tools to make your code as effective and efficient as possible. So you have set up your coding environment, Python and the Django framework to build the elements of the web application. You have the correct version of Python and Django installed on your local machine and can now work with the database and development server, allowing you to interact and test the Little Lemon web application. You have an IDE or a code editor installed and set up to work with Django. Git is installed on your machine and your GitHub account is set up, allowing you to add a remote repository for your code. The principles of setting up a project with the Django framework were revisited, and your development process of working with static content has been established. The scope and the project's purpose have been defined by gathering the user's objectives and goals. Throughout this module, you had an opportunity to complete some hands-on exercises. They included setting up the repository, setting up the Django project, committing the project, setting up the static routes, and serving the static content. Having set up your coding environment, repository, and framework, you are in a fantastic position to begin coding the project. Well done. In this video, you will recap working with databases and models. Recall that Django uses the MVT architecture, where the model represents the application's data layer. The model is at the core of Django's Object Relation Mapping, or ORM. It is the single definitive source of information about your data, where each model maps to a single database table. The primary advantage of ORM is that it is possible to interact with the database in an object-oriented manner, rather than executing raw SQL queries from inside the view functions. Recall that a model is a Python class that subclasses the model class from the django.db.models module. Generally, the user-defined model has one or more class attributes. The model class maps to a database table, and the class attribute maps to a column in the table. You declare one or more model classes in a models.py file in the app package folder. It is important to remember that it is mandatory to add the app to the installed apps list defined in the project settings.py module. This allows the Django ORM to translate the model definitions into the corresponding tables. The translation of the models into tables in the backend database is performed using a process known as migrations. You use the command python manage.py migrate to populate the database with the tables used by the pre-installed applications. For the models in the rest of the apps, you need to generate a migration script to create the table structure. You use the command make migrations from the manage.py located in the project's parent folder. Django stores the migration scripts inside a migration subpackage in the app package folder. These migration scripts are incrementally auto-numbered. After the make migrations command, run the migrate command to execute create table queries for building the tables. Every time you need to make changes in the structure of the model, such as adding, modifying, or removing a field attribute of a model class, run the make migrations command to propagate the changes to the mapped table. Django's migration mechanism also acts like version control. You can always fall back on the database state at any previous position with the help of a numbered migration script. You can interact with the model and with the table through the model directly from inside the Django shell. To open the Django shell, run the command python3 manage.py shell. In this interactive shell, you can import the model you have defined. For example, suppose you have a menu model in the Little Lemon app. You use the import statement to import the model. The model class contains the methods to add, update, and delete, and these methods are also inherited by the menu model class. You can also access the menu model from the Django admin interface. And to do this, you must register this model with the admin site. In this video, you had a recap about working with databases and models in the Django framework. The Django framework is an ideal tool for building web applications. If required, its templating system renders a HTML response by inserting dynamic content in the template web page. An API returns either a JSON or XML response. The Django REST framework, or DRF, acts as a wrapper around the core Django package. DRF converts the model instances into JSON format, serializes them, and renders it to the client as the response of the view function. In this video, you will explore the steps to build REST APIs for performing CRUD operations on the menu and the booking models. Let's step through the process now. First, you must install the Django REST framework using the pip command. Next, add rest_framework to the list of installed apps in the project's settings.py file. Notice that the app named Restaurant is also added to the list. The next step is to make sure that the menu model and booking model classes are declared in the models.py file and that they have been migrated to the database. You may recall that serializing the model data to JSON is an essential step in the process. Import the model serializer class and declare its subclass corresponding to the models in the app. Similarly, you can create a booking serializer class. Save these classes in the serializers.py file. Okay, once the code to handle serialization is set up, you can develop views for the API. This scenario will demonstrate the principle of class-based views, but it's important to note that this can be achieved using function-based views. First, create a booking view class that subclasses the API view class. The get method is called when the client visits the /menu route with the HTTP get method. It returns all the menu items in JSON format. To process the post request, add the post method in the menu view class. Finally, ensure that you update the URL configuration of the app as well as the project. In the restaurant app's urls.py file, merge the URL conf of the app with that of the project. Once all these steps are complete, run the server and test the API with a HTTP client such as Postman or HTTPie or Insomnia. In this video, you explored the steps to build REST APIs for performing CRUD operations on the menu and booking models. You've completed Module 2. Great work! In this module, you revise several concepts related to models and stored procedures and adding APIs. With this revised knowledge, you are now able to connect the backend to the database and implement the menu and table booking APIs. This will all assist you in your design and development of the Little Lemon Reserve a Table functionality of the website. In the first lesson of this module, you revised how to work with models and stored procedures. You recapped the concepts of models, migrations, and object relational mapping. One practical example of their importance is that the programming language of the framework can manipulate the database without the need to write SQL to interact with the database. Next, you recap the configuration options for setting up a MySQL database and completed an exercise setting up a MySQL database connection and testing that it's up and running. In the next lesson of the module, you revised how to work with APIs. You recapped the Django REST framework and its features for designing APIs for the project. DRF allows you to create APIs much more efficiently because it can retrieve data from the database, process it, and then represent it to your clients as JSON, XML, or other data formats. Just some of the DRF benefits are that you have a built-in API viewer at your disposal. Throughout this module, you had an opportunity to complete some hands-on exercises. They included setting up the MySQL connection, setting up the models, querying the stored procedures, setting up the menu API, and setting up the table booking API. Now that the project functionality is covered, you're ready to move on. In the next module, you'll code some specific functionality to secure and test the Little Lemon web application. Great work! No matter what type of app you build, it's always important to secure your app's users from threats. For example, unauthenticated users must be prohibited from using the app. In this video, you will recap the process of securing your app in Django. Recall that the authentication system of the core Django framework is session-based. Furthermore, Django's auth backends authenticate requests as they pass through middleware. The Django REST framework allows you to employ different authentication schemes, such as remote user authentication, session authentication, and token-based authentication. Let's explore these in a little more detail now. The basic authentication scheme uses HTTP basic authentication signed against a user's username and password. Basic authentication is generally only appropriate for testing. If successfully authenticated, basic authentication provides the following credentials. Request.user will be a Django user instance. Request.auth will be none. Unauthenticated responses that are denied permission will result in a HTTP 401 unauthorized response. The session authentication scheme uses Django's default session backend for authentication. Session authentication is appropriate for AJAX clients that are running in the same session context as your website. Finally, token authentication is appropriate for client-server setups, such as native desktop and mobile clients. To use token authentication, start by adding rest_framework.auth token in the installed_apps list in the settings.py file and run the migrate command. This will create the necessary table structure to hold the generated tokens. It's important to remember that a token is a string of random alphanumeric characters. You can generate a token for any user through the Django admin panel, or tokens can be generated programmatically. Usually, any route defined in the URL conf of the project can be accessed by anybody. To secure a view, add the permission class's decorator above it in the code. The decorator requires the isAuthenticated attribute defined in the permissions module. Now open the settings.py file again. Go to the rest_framework configuration section and set token authentication as the default authentication class. While you can create a token for the user from inside the admin panel, you can also generate it from an API endpoint. Open the urls.py file of your app and add the import statement to obtain the auth token. Next, add the routes in the URL patterns list to set the route for obtain_auth_token view. Once the code is set up, send a post request from a HTTP client such as Postman or Insomnia to the auth token endpoint. Then you'll be prompted to enter a username and password. Once entered, you'll get a token in response that you can use to make HTTP calls to the protected URLs. In this video, you recap the process of securing your app in Django using basic session and token authentication. Testing is essential to the software development lifecycle and is required to validate that your code works as expected. While working with existing code, you can use tests to ensure your changes haven't affected your application's behavior. Testing a web application can be difficult as it involves action at several layers, such as request handling, form validation and processing, and template rendering. In this video, you will recap the concept of testing using the unit test framework to test an API. Let's explore the steps involved. First, install the Django REST framework in the current Python environment and start a Django project with Little Lemon as the name. Inside the project, create a Django app called Little Lemon API. Add the REST framework and Little Lemon API to the installed apps inside the settings.py file. Next, create a model called menu item and run the migrations. Create an admin super user and log into the Django administration interface. Once logged in, populate the menu items table with some data. Then open the file serializers.py and create the necessary serialization code. The next step is creating the views for menu items and single items. Once you create the views, create the appropriate URL routing in the urls.py file of the app. Additionally, make sure to include the URL patterns of the app in the urls.py file of the project. Once the code is set up, run the command to launch the development server. The Django REST framework provides a browsable API that generates HTML output for different resources. It facilitates interaction with a RESTful web service through any web browser. Open the browser at the default localhost URL and add /API/menu items to the URL. An interface loads and you can send HTTP requests through it. It's important to know that you can also use the Insomnia REST client to interact with the API and test the routes. Open the Insomnia REST extension for your browser and create a new request. Send a GET request to the required URL. Choose the POST request option and enter the body parameters for the menu item model in JSON format. Press the Post button and notice that a new instance of the model is added to the table. The final step is to create the unit test. Create a tests folder inside the Little Lemon package folder and create the file test_models.py. Add the model test code and save the file. Run the test command to perform the test. Notice that the console displays the result with the test information and that the test ran successfully. In this video, you learn to test the RESTful API with the Browsable API, Insomnia client, and with unit test. You've completed Module 3. Great work! In this module, you revise security and testing by revisiting the topics of user authentication and API testing. With this revised knowledge, you are now able to set up user registration and authentication, and test the application with unit tests and Insomnia. This will all assist you in your design and development of the Little Lemon Reserve a Table functionality of the website. In the first lesson of this module, you revised how to work with user authentication. You recapped the functionality of the different authentication schemes, such as remote user authentication, session authentication, and token-based authentication. In this first lesson, you had an opportunity to complete some hands-on exercises. They included exercises to add the registration page, add the login page, add the logout functionality, and secure the table booking API. In the second lesson of this module, you revised how to test the API. You recapped the concept of testing using the unit test framework to test an API. Then you revised the code required, such as the code for the serializers.py file. Finally, you revised how to use the Insomnia REST client to interact with the API and test the routes. You created and performed a unit test that ran successfully and performed as expected. In this second lesson, you also had an opportunity to complete some hands-on exercises. They included exercises to add unit tests and testing the API using Insomnia. Now that this module's topics are covered, you're ready to move on. In the final module, you will synthesize the skills from this course, take the project assessment, and evaluate other learners. Great work and good luck. Wow, you've made it to the end of the course. Why don't you take a moment to congratulate yourself? After all, you've learned a lot in this course. Let's recap. In the first module, you revised starting the project. You started your preparation for the Capstone project by revising topics such as composing a back-end application using multiple skills, using Django to serve static HTML content, and committing the project to a Git repository. Throughout the first module, you had an opportunity to complete some hands-on exercises. They included setting up the repository, setting up the Django project, committing the project, setting up the static routes, and serving the static content. In the next module, you covered project functionality. In this module, you revised topics such as connecting the backend to the database and implementing the menu and table booking APIs. This module's exercises included the following: setting up the MySQL connection, setting up the models, querying the stored procedures, setting up the menu API, and setting up the table booking API. In the third module, you covered security and testing. In this module, you recapped the main topics such as setting up user registration and authentication and testing the application with unit tests and Insomnia. In this module, you completed hands-on exercises such as adding the registration page, adding the login page, adding the logout functionality, securing the table booking API, adding unit tests, and testing the API using Insomnia. You've covered a lot in this course, and you can be very proud of yourself for how much you've already learned and accomplished on your journey to becoming a back-end developer. You're now ready to take the final graded assessment. Thank you. It's been a pleasure to embark on this journey of exploration with you. Best of luck in the future as a back-end developer.